The comedian Dave Allen died in his sleep last night. He was 68. For several years he was a fixture on television, perched on a bar stool, a cigarette in one hand, glass of whiskey in the other, telling politically incorrect stories and jokes which dealt with sex, religion and alcohol, and sometimes all three. Rather than hear people pay tribute to him, although there have been many tributes, including some from PM listeners, we thought you might like to hear a little of Dave Allen himself, in his own words, doing what he did best.
This character arrives in a very rural part of Ireland. It's a town. And he's aware of the kind of atmosphere of the town even before he gets to it, because there's a stillness about the town. And normally towns are filled with bustle and cattle and markets and gossip and neighbours, and there's nothing. There's no movement at all. And as he walks down the streets of this town, all he sees is occasionally the curtain of a house move as he passes by, and little faces looking at him as he goes down, until he eventually comes to the square. And in the square is a funeral entourage, which is made up of a coffin being carried by 6 men in black, and behind it is a very, very tall, extreme-looking man. By extreme, I would mean that his face looks like it's been cut from granite, cold eyes and a great chin. And on a lead, he has this enormous Irish wolfhound. Extraordinary. I mean, even double the size of a normal Irish hound. And his tongue is lolling out, and his eyes are red and bloodshot, and it's a fierce-looking dog. And behind the dog is another man in black, and behind that man is another man in black, and there's just a line of people walking behind this coffin. So the stranger is totally enthralled by this, and he can't curtail his curiosity at all. And he runs up to this great-looking man with a granite face, and he says, "Excuse me, what's happening here?" He said, "I'm burying my wife." He said, "Oh, this is your wife dead?" He said, "Yes, dead." Obviously, she was a deeply loved person by the atmosphere of this funeral. He said, "No, she was the most despised person in the whole town. Everybody hated her. Everybody prayed that she'd die every day, and she didn't." And he said, "Nobody liked her at all?" He said, Nobody liked her, nobody loved her. She was a despised person." And he said, "Well, obviously the dog. This was her dog. At least the dog loved her. The dog going to the funeral. The dog hated her. The dog killed her. The dog bit her throat out." And the stranger said, "Could I buy that dog?" And he says, "Get to the end of the queue."
Dave Allen, who's died at the age of 68, and Paul T. in Ripon, Texas, to say, "Good night, Dave Allen, and may your God go with you." 3 minutes to 6. John Hammond has the weather. Hello, John.
Strong, vibrant voice.
He and his collaborators won huge audiences to his television shows.
Don't ever change.
He was a journalist originally, so of course he drew lots of his stuff from everyday stories of life and just twisted them, the quirky side of life.
At one stage, he retired, only to make a comeback in the 1990s.
I still am retired. But to keep myself during my retirement in a manner to which I'm accustomed to, I have to work.
Beneath that Irish twinkle was a sometimes barbed but humane sense of humour.
Thank you for listening. Whatever God you support, may he go with you. Good night. Thank you.
Their time now. A cigarette and the gift of the gab. Dave Allen, who died last night, aged 68, was the first stand-up comic who sat down and fired off a series of exegesis on the church, particularly the Catholic Church, sex, alcohol, often liberally laced with expletives, or delivered seemingly random thoughts on the absurdities of modern life. Rules were there to be broken, and his Irish charm got him out of a lot of trouble with the establishment. A determined atheist, he apparently wanted his headstone to read, "Don't mourn for me now, don't mourn for me never, I'm never going to do nothing, and forever and ever."
We actually have the most extraordinary kind of code of behaviour which we hog tie ourselves with. I mean, we behave totally different in our own house than we would outside. Social behaviour, it's called. I mean, if you wake up in the morning at home and you yawn, don't you? It's a big, you go, it's great. But if you're in company and you feel like yawning, you go, great thing, actually, if you get on a train, the carriage is full, to get rid of people. All you do is go... They all get up and go. Till you're left with one fella, and he's sitting there going...
Michael, what did Dave Allen's humour mean to you?
Well, watching Dave Allen when I was younger was really an initiation into adulthood. It was one of the first programmes, late-night programmes, as it were, that I was allowed to watch by my parents. And it did feel as though I was genuinely encountering adult humour for the first time. Sardonic, dry, knowing, observational. So I have very, very happy memories and therefore regard him as the route into the adult comedy that I subsequently enjoyed, far more than, say, the surrealist comedy of Monty Python. I prefer the observational, dry wit of Allen.
Revisiting some of the sketches today, you remember just how groundbreaking he was.
Yeah, I'd forgotten how sort of modern he was, and he reminds me a bit of Bill Hicks or someone like that nowadays, that kind of very dry delivery, and also he was actually tougher and much more political than I remembered him being, you know, in some of his skits.
And you remember from an earlier period?
Well, yeah, I realise, now that I do stand-up, I realise he's a formative influence, and that perhaps he taught me how to be really fed up with hypocrisy and inconsistency and false reasoning and all of that, and the Catholic Church.
But because just this very point of the Catholic Church, it's interesting today, you wonder whether, by extension to other religions and so forth, the kind of humour he was doing then and the pokes he was having at religion would actually be a bit of a problem today.
Well, he'd be breaking the law, potentially,
Yes.
under the laws of religious hatred. I mean, actually, the whole point was it was a classic subversion that all comics should have. He was focusing in on authority when he was being brought up in reactionary Ireland in the 1940s. It was the Catholic Church that was the obvious target. Its authority was, you know, ludicrously overextended. It was a ripe target. But you're absolutely right, Kirsty, in the environment that we have now, you know, with Beshti being banned and all the rest of it, then Dave Allen would be in fear of his career.
Well, the comedian Dave Allen, who has died. You can see a special programme on him here on BBC Two on the 2nd of April. Thanks to my guests, Jermaine Greer, Grayson Perry and Michael Gove. Newsnight Review will be back next Friday at 11 o'clock with the return of Doctor Who. For more details and useful links, visit bbc.co.uk/newsnightreview. Back to you, Gavin.
Kirsty, thanks very much.
And finally tonight, he was a comedian who broke the mould long before the arrival of alternative comedy, with his jokes targeting a range of subjects from sex to religion.
The Irish comedian Dave Allen has died at the age of 68. His popular shows spanned 4 decades until he retired in 1994. Shuli Ghosh looks back on a comedy great.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Allen.
A household favourite loved by millions, Dave Allen often performed with a drink firmly in hand.
If you're all going to booze, I'm going to booze with you. Good health. Cheers.
The irreverent Dublin-born performer was politically incorrect before the phrase was even coined. He frequently targeted the church. "I'm an atheist," he said. Thank God.
Yes, my son. 2 bob on Pixie each way in the 3
In his inimitable style, he told stories reflecting the absurdity of life.
They'll boast about a watch that can tell you the time at 50 fathoms. Who in the name of Christ is going to ask you what time it is at 50 fathoms?
Today, fellow performers paid tribute to the comedian they called the original grumpy old man.
Dave Allen was a unique comedian, a one-off. 40 years, 4 decades he stretched across. Not many comedians can do that.
Thank you for listening. Whatever God you support, may he go with you. Good night. Thank you.
Well, Shuli Ghosh there on the death of Dave Allen, and that is the evening news tonight. Next on the ITV
That
News.
routine mocked every level of the establishment, including the Catholic Church. His trademarks, of course, were the ever-present cigarettes and glass of whiskey. Romilly Weeks looks back at a life in comedy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Allen.
He was utterly at home on stage, the audience in the palm of one hand, glass never far from the other.
If you're all going to booze, I'm going to booze with you. Good health. Cheers.
But behind Dave Allen's easy charm, there was sharp satire.
Ireland is a nation populated by what we call Catholics and Protestants. And I suppose if you're all atheists, there might be a good chance of us living together like Christians.
Never scared to break fiercely guarded taboos, his was a new brand of alternative comedy that made him a huge television star and influenced a whole generation of comics.
Dave Allen was a unique comedian, a one-off. 40 years, 4 decades he stretched across. Not many comedians can do that.
Yes, my son. 2 bob on Pixie each way in the 3 seconds.
Dave Allen died at the age of 68, having once said that what he wanted written on his tombstone was "Don't mourn for me now, don't mourn for me never. I'm going to do nothing forever and ever."
Thank you for listening. Whatever God you support, may he go with you. Good night. Thank you.
Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
As does